Welcome to Deusto International Talks. My name is Giana de Miranda Leschko, and as part of Deusto International team, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Deusto International Talks, and in particular to today's session around the changing landscape of international management. Before we start, we would like to inform you that the talk is being recorded and you will receive the session's video shortly. Moreover, during the session, feel free to make any questions or comments you may have through the chat. At the end of the talk, our guest panelists will reply to any questions you may have posted during the webinar. The global context has changed so much in recent years that international companies and their managers have had to adapt swiftly. In this session, we will discuss the increasingly complex range of challenges that international managers face today, from managing mobility in global teams to consolidating existing and new client relations in hybrid, remote, and in-person settings. In order to provide a deeper analysis of the topic, I'm pleased to introduce today's session's guest panelists, Amaia Arizkuren, Professor and Director of the Master of International Business at the Deusto Business School, and Ciara O'Higgins, Lecturer in Strategy and International Business at the Deusto Business School. Many thanks to our panelists for your presence today with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a gorgeous initiative that we really are glad that you proposed to us. In my master, we have the opportunity, and we are very glad to have Ciara O'Higgins as lecturer of one of our modules, International Strategy. She's an expert in this area, and she has a lot of previous experience before entering the university in companies that really were related to internationalization. So, Ciara, thank you for accepting our invitation of being here, sharing an area of expertise that it's really very unique in this moment, and we are really glad to listen to your opinion. You are an expert of internationalization. Please, how do you think that the landscape changing for international managers?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much also for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. In answer to your question, Amaia, I think that the first thing that we need to think about is the huge uncertainty that we're faced with at the moment. I'm going to just share a few slides. So I think that the first point that we need to think about is that managers today, international managers, are faced with a huge amount of uncertainty. As we see here in the photograph, we can't see what's in front of us. We can't see if we have another mountain in front of us after the pandemic. Who could have thought we would be facing now war on the European continent? We can't see what's in front of us, if it's a valley, if it's another mountain. And I think this is the first thing that we're in a huge uncertainty at the moment. There are several different frameworks that try to explain this and help us make sense of this. On the one hand, we have the VUCA framework, which the V is for volatility, U for uncertainty, C for complexity, and A for ambiguity. This is a military term that stems from the Cold War. We've been talking about VUCA environments for several decades now. And recently a new term has arisen, which is BANI, which would be B for brittle, A for anxious, N for non-linear, and I for incomprehensible. As we see these different acronyms give it different words to try and make sense of the uncertainty that we're living today. I think that whether we're talking or whether we prefer the VUCA acronym or the BANI acronym, or depending on which framework that we use to help us try and make sense of all this, I think what we need to do is to think about uncertainty in terms of our relations with our external stakeholders. So with our suppliers, with our clients, with our institutions that we are involved with in the context that we're involved with. and also think of uncertainty in an internal sense in terms of our teams, our staff, our managers. And I think we need to look at both of these issues and try and understand and make sense of how that world is affecting each one of the internal and external stakeholders. So how would we do that? Well, I would suggest thinking, first of all, about our strengths as a company, try and strengthen our strengths. What are we good at, and how can we keep being good at that, regardless of the environment or the context in which we're operating? Perhaps what are our potential weaknesses or our potential threats? And with both of those weaknesses and those threats, I think for companies, it's similar to individuals, to people. We need to think about what can I control, what is within my control, and what is outside of my control. And I can only act and affect on the things that are within my control. So as a company, I can't control whether there will be a pandemic or not. I can't control whether there will be a war or not. But I can control how I relate to my clients, how I establish and maintain those relationships. Even regardless of the pandemic, I can try and strengthen those relationships with my suppliers, with my clients. And internally also, I can think about how to work with our teams, what things are affecting our individuals and our teams and our managers, and how we can try and help and adapt to those things.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that all that lead companies to rethink their internationalization?
I would say that yes. I think we're at a key point now at the moment. I think that in the beginning of the 21st century, I think there was a push to internationalize firms, and those of us who worked in internationalization and tried to stimulate that companies would go abroad, we had to convince companies to go abroad. It's important. There are many reasons why firms should go abroad and internationalize. And then at least here in Spain and in the Basque Country, in the year 2008, the global crisis hit us quite strong. And so our local markets were quite limited. And there all of a sudden we saw a push to internationalization. And many of our companies, our Basque companies here, our Spanish companies went abroad, and there was a wave of internationalization. And I would say that in the last decade, we haven't really had to convince people that it was important to internationalize. It was in the organizational psyche. We were clear on the importance of operating in a global context and going abroad. And I think that now in the last 2 years, what we're seeing is that firms are trying to rethink really this internationalization and refocus and ask themselves, I would say, 3 key questions. The first one will be, why are we internationalizing? Is it because we want to buy abroad? Is it because we want to produce abroad and produce cheaper? Is it because we want to sell abroad? Why is it that we're in other markets? Do we want to learn? Are there new resources, new capabilities in other places that we want to learn? And so I think firms really need to think about now, why are we going abroad? What is our core activity, and what are the core activities that we think should be done in an international context? Once they're clear on that, whether it's to buy, to produce, to learn, to sell, then the next thing that we need to think about is where are the right markets for that? And I think in the last several decades, globalization has increased. It's been easier to travel. It's been easier to go and meet people, meet companies, find new clients and new partners. And so that ease of travel has also led us to find many opportunities and meet many different companies that we could work with, whether suppliers or clients. And now I think we really need to think about, where do I need to be to do those core activities that I want to do? If I want to get supply from different suppliers around the world, if my goal is procurement, international procurement, then I need to think about where I can find those suppliers and how can I diversify these different suppliers so that I have different options when things occur around the world. And I think that here in the case of where, perhaps in the last decade, we've paid less attention to risk factors. And I think now that's a huge issue and an important issue that we need to think about in terms of where we need to really do risk assessment of the different countries where we're present. And then I think the third thing is that we need to rethink how. For a long time, we've thought about entry modes or operation modes in terms of I open an office to sell, a commercial office, or I open a plant in order to produce, or I have sales representatives. And we've thought in kind of binary terms of one type of way of operating in a country. And I think that now firms are what we're seeing when we talk to firms, to different managers that come and talk in our masters, the different companies we work with, both in research and collaborating with. What we're seeing is that now companies are being a little bit more flexible with this and combining different modes, combining different ways of being present in different countries, perhaps with an office, but also with representatives, and combining these different ways of being present in different markets. So I would say that yes, in the last 2 years, we really had to rethink, why are we going abroad? Exactly for what reason? Which are the real important reasons that we need to prioritize, the reasons for which we need to be abroad? Exactly in which countries we want to be, and where and what markets do we need to be for those core activities? And then in what way are we there? How are we there? Well, what kind of presence and what kind of operations we have in those different markets?
Mm-hmm. But in any case, Ciara, if our intent is to buy or to produce abroad, what do you think that we need to take into consideration?
Well, I think that the first thing that we need to consider is that our supply chains, our value chains have become global, and we source from many different countries, and we sell in many different countries. And of course, not only do these supply chains, are they now global, but they also need to be sustainable, both of course economically, but also socially and environmentally. And I think that these are important elements that we need to consider when we're managing our global supply chains. Now, in this particular aspect, I'm not an expert, but we have many experts here at the university and who collaborate with us in the masters. For example, our colleague Bart Kamp, who is a researcher at Orchestra, which is the Basque Institute for Competitiveness. He also participates in our strategy module in the masters, and he's been writing recently on many of these issues, and how our global supply chains, how global supply has been interrupted by everything that's going on, and how different companies are adapting, and how they need to diversify their sources, and how we can try and adapt to this. It's been encouraged. Our markets in the last decade have been liberalized, and there's been a great push to globalization and to internationalize, as we said before. And now we're in a situation where many companies are highly internationalized and highly global, with complex global supply chains, and now they need to reassess how they're going to manage that. Do they need to be in all of those places? Where do our suppliers come from? Where do we supply from? Recently, we saw here in Spain that the tuna canning industry, for example, sources much of their sunflower oil that's used in the canning for tuna fish. Most of it came from Ukraine and from Russia. And so now they're in a situation where they have to rethink and diversify their suppliers. And those firms that were operating in Latin America and had suppliers in Latin America are in a better position, because they can now source to Spain from Latin America instead of Ukraine. So we're seeing that we have to rethink the whole structure of the global supply chain. Mm-hmm. We have here in the Basque Country, sorry, Amaia, here in the Basque Country, we have many industrialized firms, small and medium-sized firms that are highly internationalized and that have integrated global supply chains, and they're having to rethink many of their positions, of course, because the global supply chain was interrupted in many cases because of the pandemic, and now because of the war. So we're seeing many of our companies with which we work, and many of these participate as speakers also in our masters. They're facing these situations now, and they're having to reassess all of these decisions now.
Mm-hmm. Clear. We spoke about buying or producing abroad. What about selling in international markets, Ciara?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, share with our students.
Here we're seeing something very interesting, in that the sales processes are also changing. During the pandemic in the first few months here in 2020, when we were locked in, when we were confined, we were speaking to many of the companies with which we work and on whom we do research. And what we were seeing is that in the first months, these companies had re-established contact with their customers, with their clients. They'd been talking to them, and they'd been really identifying new opportunities or helping their companies adapt to confinement and adapt to the pandemic. And they had found many new projects with existing clients. And so in the first few months, this was keeping a lot of companies afloat, especially service firms or professional service firms, which are the ones that I do more research on. And many of these firms were saying, actually, in the first few months, we were okay because, you know, we were executing or delivering the projects that we had. We were talking with our existing clients, trying to see how we could help them, support them in this move to online work and to hybrid work. But then what started to happen at the end of 2020 and moving into 2021 is that they were realizing that it was harder and harder to find new clients. So they had consolidated and established a lot of work and new projects with their existing clients, but they were finding it very difficult to find new clients because, of course, once you've established a relationship, you can maintain that relationship online. But if you've never met somebody and you need to establish a trust relationship because you want to work with them, you want to sell to them, you want to do projects with them, or you want to sell them a new product, it's very difficult to do that remotely. It's very difficult to establish trust on a first-time basis, or to develop that relationship online. It's much easier to maintain a relationship online once you've had it. So we've seen here a shift in terms of consolidation of relations with existing clients, and then a need to see how do we adapt to this new situation where it's much more difficult to travel, it's much more difficult to meet people. Do we still shake hands when we meet in person? I mean, there are many things that have become much more difficult. It's much more difficult to meet people and to travel. And so we're seeing now that there's a shift in the sales process of how sales are done. Before, we would get on a plane and we would travel to the country. And once we were there, we would see if we could get meetings, and we would fill our agenda with as many meetings as possible. And there was a lot more let's say, improvisation on the ground. Of course, we went with some meetings and we had some idea of what our agenda was, but we had space to be flexible on the ground and to meet new opportunities, new clients, new relations. Of course, that's much more difficult now. It's much more costly to travel, not only in terms of the price of travel, but in terms of the opportunities that the cost opportunity of travel. And so now what we're seeing is that there's a lot more work, a lot more preparation, a lot more systematization of the process, of the earlier stages of the sales process. So much more rigorous preparation, much more rigorous pre-contact, much more preparation of the online profile of the companies, so that when we do come into contact with those potential clients, we're ready and we are at our best. So there's a lot less of that improvisation. There's a lot less travel, although we're beginning to see travel pick up again. And so now when we do go and we meet those clients, we've done a lot of our homework before. And I was speaking to somebody the other day, another collaborator in our masters, Arizkuren Santiago from the company Onura, and he's an expert in sales and international sales. He helps companies with their sales process. And he was telling me that he was seeing an interesting shift in the sense that the gap between senior salespeople and junior salespeople is beginning to be shortened. Because of all this digital preparation and the use of digital marketing and the use of IT tools that are now being incorporated into the sales process, younger salespeople are in a much better position, and the capabilities that they have now make them much more valuable at an early stage for the sales process. And so more senior salespeople who have more of this tacit or experiential knowledge of when is a client relation mature, when we start talking to them about closing an offer, about closing a deal. Those skills, of course, are still extremely valuable, but those salespeople, those senior salespeople, need to start incorporating also these technological support mechanisms and process. So we're seeing an extremely interesting shift as a researcher. I think it's fascinating. We're seeing here an interesting shift in sales processes and how they're changing, and how do we combine what activities can we do and must we do remotely, and what activities still need to be done in person, and so for which we need to travel. So here again, we're seeing a shift in rethinking. No? When do we travel? What do we travel for? And how often do we travel? I think there's an interesting element here. Are we going to see a shift towards a lot less short-term travel and mobility, or are we going to are people going to continue traveling for 2 or 3 days? Or now when I go to Colombia and I cross over to Latin America, do I make it a longer trip and do several countries in the same region and spend more time? But Amaia, you're an expert in mobility. Are you seeing a shift in this sense?
Yes, without any doubt. The pandemic by itself got a lot of problems for companies to get the visas for their travelers all around the world. So that's first time when in 2020 we got the hard pandemic, but after that the economic crisis came with the logistic crisis. So though that scenario really got in the internationalization of the personnel that is going to be involved in different countries' operations, several changes. First one is that really the profile of the expats changed dramatically. You were speaking about the uncertainty in your economic scenario. Well, that has been for sure a big difference in the profile that we need for the expats to get adapted to this uncertainty. We really sadly needed expats and needed people involved in internationalization with a huge sense of adaptation, because really that became the most important part of the profile, along with the knowledge of the IT technologies that really suddenly were very, very important, because suddenly everything was online. So really to maintain a relationship with your colleagues in another country, with your bosses in another country, or with even in your own country colleagues, no matter the country it is, became a very important problem if you did not master the IT technology that you needed to work with. That alone with a very important change in the profile of the expats related to the global vision they need to have. After the pandemic, as companies need to find the small advantages everywhere, no matter the year, the opportunities for doing business in different markets has increased so much, because we are obliged to, as we have less profits in a specific country, we need managers, we need expats that really understand a much newer scenario that really is very important for the expats to have as a profile for the future of the company. So the profile of the expats has been a very, very huge change that the pandemic and the economic crisis that came after brought to us. Another thing that has been very, very importantly changed has been the number of expats. Companies tried suddenly to reduce, or because they don't have the visas, the health visas that the different governments required, or because the economic crisis, when you have your production totally closed, oblige you not to spend apartments and so on. So really, companies tend to reduce, if possible, the number of expats physically working in another country. I am not saying that the expats have disappeared, because the responsibilities were still remained, but working from the headquarters company. So that has been a huge change in the scenario of the mobility for the personnel working outside. Another thing has been for the training. The training and the investments that companies had need to implement regarding IT technologies. If we have been obliged to really work from home, we really need to invest in more IT technologies and the systems and the knowledge about them in all our workers. So that has been a very important change that the pandemic brought to all the companies, no matter in the headquarters and in the subsidiaries. And finally, I would say also that the pandemic and the post consequences brought much worse economic conditions for the people that it's involved on the internationalization. Companies realize that to work outside in a subsidiary for your expats perhaps is not necessary to live in the best neighborhood, or it's not necessarily obligatory that I, as a company, will pay to the schools of your kids, or I won't necessarily be in need of paying for the extra salary bonus that tried to compensate the loss of quality of your life. So perhaps I am going to try to reduce, because I have had really a very problematic discount on the income that the pandemic obliged us to have. So those, especially those 4 aspects, yes, I think that still will be very important, with more changes in the international personnel mobility that normally we were used to see at the companies.
And what about teams and how the relationships within the firm? I mean, you and I have worked together and collaborated often on issues relating to management of international teams, intercultural relations, and how we manage those. And that was already difficult before the pandemic hit, before remote work. And I think in relation, you know, what we were saying before, to relationships with clients, that it's difficult to establish relationships with new clients. I imagine that you are seeing something similar to what I'm seeing, which is that teams that know each other well are surviving well with the online mode, but it's become harder for teams, intercultural teams, to interact fluidly in this situation. Are you seeing something like that as well? Are you seeing a change in global teams?
Yeah, most of the things that I was listening to your presentation really are exactly the same ones for the intercultural teams that, as workers, we need to maintain inside the company with different subsidiaries and the headquarters. Most of them are similar. Some others, for instance, as a consequence of sending less expats, companies start to rethink about the need of promoting local managers to the positions that before were occupied by expats. That means that we are start watching companies that bring to the headquarters impacts that really we need to fidelize, we need to really transmit our headquarters culture, and that makes that here at the headquarters, a lot of more intercultural teams are, and not everybody at the Basque Country is prepared to receive with open arms, because they are not used, because they don't speak a lot of languages, because they really are with their problems. Additionally, as you said, working from their houses, it's not so easy to provide that image that the company really wants to provide to the expats. So that has been a new scenario for a lot of companies. And with the international intercultural teams also are very important, and I am repeating a little bit your speech, but most of the intercultural teams have been obliged to work remotely. And really, it's not as easy to understand others' perspectives. It's not as easy to really arrive to create, as a manager responsible of HR, it's not as easy to create really a goal unique for a multicultural team, if all of us, you are working remotely and you don't have opportunity to shake your hands or really go outside to have a glass of beer or really be really sharing day-to-day activities in a physical way that in some countries is much more important than in others, but really in general, it is really something that as a problematic issue we really need to solve in the future.
What I've seen also, to add to that, what I've seen also is that around the world, the pandemic hit different countries or different regions at different times. So while we here in Europe, for example, perhaps in the summer of 2020, we're starting to go out again. And so some companies had people come back into the office, is when it was winter in Latin America, and that's when the pandemic hit there. So on top of everything else, of the intercultural issues and of in each particular location or the headquarters or different subsidiaries, we have to think about, is it time to bring people back into the office? How often? How do we organize it? On top of that, now we're looking at it in Europe, then we're looking at it, we have in December, in Europe, we have to go back to offline to online work, whereas in Latin America it's with summer or other places around the world. And so on top of managing different time zones, managing different cultures, managing different teams all around the world. Now we have additional elements to add to that complexity, in the sense that what we're facing in different places around the world is kind of off in terms of timing, which makes all of that management much more complex. And I would say, I don't know what your experience is, Amaia, or what you think, but I think here there's also an element of a kind of a mind shift. We have to go back to thinking about individuals and what individuals or what our teams need, and different teams may need different things at different times. And so it becomes much more difficult to have blanket policies that go across a whole office or a whole global company around the world. And so on the one hand, it becomes more complex because we have more elements to consider, but at the same time, I think we need to bring in this element of flexibility and adapting to different situations, and empowering also individuals and teams and managers to be able to have that flexibility and to adapt to the different situations that are needed. And recently I've been listening to several podcasts who are talking about kindness in management, and several initiatives in academia or across companies in terms of leading with kindness. And I think this empathy is a really important element. Empathy, as we know, as you and I have discussed often, is an extremely important element of intercultural relations and how we have teams interact. And we need to develop this capacity to be able to understand what's going on with people that we don't know, whose culture we don't know. And I think here in the situation of so much uncertainty, and I was struck when I heard, to go back to the acronym of BANI, that the A is anxiety and nervousness is the N. I think we need to consider this from the perspective of individuals, but also the perspective of a company. If I'm a fairly small company and I have activities around the world, it makes me very vulnerable to all these elements that are happening in the context, and that we can, and this kind of links to a question that we have in the chat, which I'll read in a moment, that we have some companies who are nervous about the next step. So what's going to happen next? So it also shifts our perspective in terms of risk taking, in terms of how we take decisions. And I think that here there's an important element of flexibility and adaptability and kindness and empathy. And we need to be kind with ourselves, and international managers need to be kind to themselves in terms of how they take their decisions. They're doing the best. I think what we've seen in the last few years is people have done their best to survive through what we've been going through. And I think we need to take that into consideration, and that will be one of the elements that will glue our teams together, and bring our teams together apart, even though we're in different places around the world. And perhaps I can just read also the question we have here. Do you have any suggestions on how to sway or convince traditional people who want to still go back to the old normal ways, rather than thinking of new and innovative ways of moving forward? Do you want to take that first, or?
Be ahead, my guest.
I think that there are several elements here. I think the first is that context is going to be a large limitation. I think there are many issues in where we're just not going to be able to go back or it's going to take a very, very long time to go back. So we're going to have to adapt. And I think that companies and individuals are going to have to adapt. And I think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning of what do we have control over and what do we not have control over? And there are many elements of the context that we don't have control over, and we're going to have to change whether we like it or not. And then in terms of, motivating and suggesting to people, I would say that there are opportunities in uncertainty. There are good things about uncertainty, and there are things that we can try and make the best of. Somebody was telling me the other day that in times of uncertainty, companies don't change their suppliers. If their suppliers are working and delivering to them, the chances that now you would change your suppliers are very low, because if I'm getting my supplies, I'm extremely lucky. So why would I go out and switch? No. So I think in that uncertainty, there are also some positive elements that there are strong relationships between suppliers and companies can be strengthened. And so I think it's a question of trying to find the positive aspects out of the uncertainty and trying to focus on finding new and innovative ways to try and address those issues. It comes back to being adaptable and flexible, and sometimes that is difficult, but it's more motivating when we see new or innovative things that we can hang on to.
That's all right. Any more questions?
We don't have any more questions for the moment.
So if we don't have any questions, I would like to add something that you were speaking about, how it's very interesting to realize about the diversity of how the pandemic hit different parts of the world. And also how it was very interesting to realize that where you need to be empathic in different countries of the world could be very different. And that's precisely a very, very nice part of the master. We start with fundamentals, that is the basic frame that anybody needs to understand and know to do business internationally. But as you said, after we have a part that is doing business in different countries, and precisely is that point that you were pointing. It's so interesting to realize how is different any of the topics that you need to face internationally speaking, in India, in China, in Africa, in Europe, in South America, in North America, really the same topics with the same theoretical frame really are very different, the application in different countries. So without any doubt, that's very important to analyze the specificity, locally speaking, about the global facts.
Yeah, and I think that often we underestimate the differences that arise in different places. We think, oh, I can adapt. Oh, I've been here, I've been there, and I think I'll be able to adapt. And often we're not conscious of the differences that exist. And often we make mistakes without even knowing that we're making those cultural faux pas in different places around the world. So I think that that's one of the big issues that's going to occur now, is that we less of an opportunity to travel. It becomes more difficult to gain all of that experience by, meeting people and seeing where the difficulties arise. That said, I think that a lot of the programs that existed for young people to travel around the world and different internships, international internships that are available, have come back. Erasmus programs, as far as I know, were only one semester unavailable, and very quickly all these things came back, and these opportunities, these structured opportunities for young people to get that training and travel around the world have been brought back very fast. So I would say that I think that I would suggest or imagine that those kind of programs are going to be more and more successful, because it becomes harder to travel kind of in an unstructured manner at the moment. So those structures give young people an opportunity to be able to move to different places around the world and have internships and opportunities. And I would definitely encourage people thinking about that to take advantage of those structures that exist, because I think that now and more we're going to need that support for those kind of opportunities.
Without any doubt. Yeah. Well, I don't know if we have more questions regarding this topic. Any subjects related to Master in International Business that we offer to here at Deusto University. Anything that you should be interested in?
I don't see any more questions coming into the chat. But here we have at the end, both Amaia and I would be happy, and I think in the information that went out, our contact details are available. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Another question has just come in, Amaia, especially for you. What background should students have? I'm not sure if the question relates directly to our masters or in general to young people who are thinking of an international management career, but perhaps you can answer first for the masters, and then I can add on to that what young people should think about in terms of developing skills for international management.
Of course, at Deusto University, we have a Deusto Business School, and this Deusto Business School will have two different masters related to internationalization. One is in Bilbao and the other one is in San Sebastian. The one in San Sebastian is seeking for profiles, especially of people that already have a background in undergraduate programs related especially to business, because we offer a master of 60 credits, and it's a very intense program related exclusively of internationalization. So we need students to come with already the knowledge of business to start with the difference that we can offer for internationalization, with the theoretical frame at the very beginning, with the specificities of the countries later, with 2 trips to China, to Morocco, or other countries that could be plan B if the visas finally are not offered by the governments due to the pandemic. And this is the background for the international master that we offer in San Sebastian. People with not a lot of experience that really has already a business background. In the Master of International area that we offer at Deusto Bilbao, at Deusto Business School, the profile tends to be quite the opposite. We offer another gorgeous program related to internationalization, but with more credits. Why? Because we start offering the business basis. So we really opened our profile to anybody that wants to enter because is interested in going abroad to work to other country. So the profile is different. That could be very well accepted in both campuses, depending on the profile that they come with. Without a lot of experience, it's common. With already a degree in business, San Sebastian, without this specialization in business, but any other, in Bilbao.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll add to that just in terms of people who are thinking about a career in international management. I think that there are 2 important elements if somebody's thinking about pursuing a career in this area. I think the first is, as you were saying, Amaia, in terms of the masters, I think a strong technical basis, strong fundamentals of international business or a specific area of business, but then with added an international layer to it. So I would say a strong technical background in terms of international management knowledge. But I think there are a lot of softer skills or competencies that need to be developed. And there's a big debate about whether those are inherent and people have those already or whether they can be developed. But I think in terms of on top of languages, to try and have as much intercultural experience as we were saying before, no, that in order to work in an international management context, we need to be able to work with people from other places. So we need to have tried that by going on Erasmus, by going to different places, doing these different internships around the world, and to have a curiosity, to be interested in learning about different people from different places, learning about the history of the countries that you travel to, learning about the culture, learning about the different elements, and trying to understand that international context in the places where we go. So I would say to be a good international manager, we need a strong technical basis on which to build, and then a lot of curiosity and interest in other cultures and moving around, and this empathy in order to understand our clients and in order to understand our teams in different places around the world.
I totally agree. Actually, regarding, for instance, languages that you were speaking about, in both masters that we have at Deusto Business School related to internationalization, the one in San Sebastian, the one in Bilbao, we required to have a C1 level of English. And in the one in Bilbao, also, they have to have knowledge of French because they continue in France their studies before going to England. So really, the mastering of languages, if you want to work abroad, is really mandatory. And the rest of the soft skills, of course, they are really very important. I totally agree with you.
Okay, so many thanks to our panelists, Amaia and Ciara, for your time and sharing your knowledge and expertise with all of us. For the assistance, many thanks also for joining us today and for your interesting question. As said before, we will receive today's session's video by email. And we will inform you about incoming Deusto International Talks through the udglobal@deusto.is. And thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Our pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.